I'm going to show you a method of painting skulls using the Fordite method. The Fordite method is a method of painting that involves layers after layers after layers of paint being applied to an object, in this case a skull. It's interesting history behind the Fordite method. It was actually sort of created or discovered in the Ford painting booth, hence Fordite. We put the cars in the paint booth and they would paint these cars, and in the corners of the paint booth all the paint would drip out, creating these big balls of paint. So you could imagine after you painted 1,000,000 cars, these big balls of paint would be, fairly large. And when they clean out the paint booth, they would cut these balls of paint off, and then some very creative people would sand those layers down, carve them into intricate little art objects, and hence the Fordite method of painting. I originally saw this method applied to a skull on a YouTube channel, The Skull Hunter, and I will attach a description to his video below. I've been using the Fordite method to highlight the unique aspects of a skull. For me personally, I'm a wildlife biologist, and I've always been interested and fascinated with sort of the anatomy, morphology, and sort of microtopography of the bone in the skulls. And skulls are so beautiful. And even though, we look at a skull and it looks the same, they all sort of look the same, when you really pay attention and look at details of the skulls, they're so different. Every animal is different. And the Fordite method sort of accentuates those differences because the paint gets into all the crevices, and when you sand the paint back down, which I'll discuss in a little bit, it highlights the uniqueness of the skull. So for me, the Fordite method is a way that sort of not only honors that animal, but celebrates the uniqueness of the skull. And so for me, that's why this method really appeals to me, is honoring that animal and just celebrating the sort of uniqueness of each skull. The method's really relatively simple. It just takes a while because you want to apply a layer of paint to the skull, let it dry completely. It's so important to let that paint dry, and sometimes people have a tendency, I know myself, have a tendency to get it hurry up, and it's really important when you're applying layer after layer to make sure that that paint has off-gassed. Otherwise, you'll get a lot of problems with subsequent layers. What you're going to need is you're going to need a skull, obviously, but that skull has to be very clean. It has to be clean of all the oil, as much cartilage as you possibly can, and if there's cartilage, make sure it's solidified, and all the dirt, everything has to be clean off that skull. It's really important to have your first coats of paint completely and totally adhere to that skull. Also, this is a time where you want to make any repairs to the skull. A lot of times when I get skulls, people will give me skulls, there'll be cracks or a rat or a mouse or some rodent who has chewed off a portion of the skull. And so you want to make repairs to that skull. I make repairs to my skulls using this product. It's a sort of a resin-based epoxy clay, if you will. And it comes in all different colors. I just use gray because I'm going to paint over the skull anyway. And you can form that putty and clay and to fix chew holes, or sometimes I'll create whole new nasal bones for animals and then sand it down, and you won't even tell the difference when you're done that animal, when it came to you, or that skull when it came to you, was missing parts, or it was damaged in some way. So if you'd like to know how to fix a skull, or maybe even make new animal bones and then start this method, I'd be happy to make another video about how to repair your skulls for painting or whatever application you're looking to do to that skull. This product is also kind of neat because it allows you to sort of enhance aspects of your skull. This is a skull I've been playing around. This is a cow skull I'm working up for a client, and I've carved 1776 into the top with some stars on it, and I'm about ready to wet sand this back down. But I also add some enhancements to the brow right here, if you could see that. It's kind of kind of badass. That's the whole look we're going for, is patriotic. And so I added some interesting brow features here, and so that's kind of another fun thing you can do with the epoxy clay. All right, once you get your skull all clean, it's exactly the way you want it. You have it all repaired. This is a cow elk skull. I've done some repairs on this skull as well, and you can't really even tell. Then you want to put your first coat, should always be a bonding primer and a sealer. I use this product. It's a Zinsser, and it's an oil-based sealer. It fills in some of the gaps, and this is the product I use as my first base coat, and it's white. I mentioned that it's white because you want your primer coat to be part of the color scheme that you've chosen to paint your skull, because you're going to dry sand it back down, and you might need your primer more than once during the process, which I'll tell you about in a second. If gray is one of my colors in my scheme, I'll switch to a Rust-Oleum. This universal bonder works really well. This product comes in a couple colors, white, gray, and a rust color too. So it gives you more options if one of those colors is in your color palette that you're using for this painting method. So once your skull's all prepped and you have that first sealer coat on there, then you can go ahead and start applying your coats of paint. I like Rust-Oleum gloss paints. To me, they seem to adhere to one another a little bit better without the risk of paint fracturing. Paint fracturing can be really frustrating, and I'll show you what that looks like right now. Paint fracturing is this sort of effect right here, where you put a layer of paint on and then it will start to fracture and sort of like peel off. If that does occur, what you can do is sand this down and then apply a layer of primer. You can see here, right here, I had some fracturing occur, and I sanded it down, and I applied a layer of primer, and then when I apply my next layer of paint, you won't even tell that I had fracturing. Paint fracturing can be very frustrating, but using the Fordite method, it can also enhance the look of the painting when you dry sand it back down. And I'll show you an example of that right now. If you do get fracturing in your skull, don't worry about it. Just sand it down and then keep applying layers of paint. But sometimes fracturing is not a bad thing, because it makes these really cool patterns in the paint that you couldn't get otherwise if it didn't fracture. This cow elk skull was really beat up, and you can kind of tell how old it is by how there's separation between the bone parts. There's so much separation, that's an indication that the cartilage that was holding all those bones together has disintegrated over the time, and those fissures, those sutures in the skull start to open up a little bit, and they make some very interesting patterns on the skull. This skull has 36 coats of paint on it, and I'm going to be starting to wet sand them back down. This bone right here was completely missing. It was chewed off by an animal, and so I recreated this bone with some epoxy. It's important that when you start sanding your paint back down, that you want to use the wet sanding technique. So you want to place your skull. This is a large cow skull that I'm working on, but it's large enough for me to give an example. You want to place your skull on something soft. I use this little excess piece of foam, because when you sand, you're going to put a lot of downward pressure on your skull, and you don't want to inadvertently like knock a tooth out or crack the skull. And some skulls, like a deer skull, is going to be a little more fragile than this big cow skull. So always make sure you have something soft to be working on. And then you're going to want to use 320 or 400 grit sandpaper to do the wet sandpaper. Anything more coarse than 320 is going to leave sandpaper lines in your skull, and that's really hard to sort of overcome. So use fine grade sandpaper, 320 minimum, 400, that's what I'll use. And I'll make small circles as I go, wipe it off, small circles as I go. I'm going to speed up the rest of the video so that I don't bore you to death. But as you can see, there's lots of sanding involved. There's small circles, small circles, small circles on all parts of the skull where you want to reveal the paint. Be sure to constantly wipe off the area that you've sanded so that you can see your work. Sometimes I will sand and realize I want to go a little deeper, or I want to extend that pattern a little further. So it's small circle, small circle, small circle, wipe it off. Sand, 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 wipe it off. When you're all done with your wet sanding process, then you're going to want to take and make sure it's dry, and make sure all the dust is off too. So when I'm done wet sanding my product and I have the pattern the way I want it, I'm satisfied with it, I'll take it into the sink under some water, and I will make sure I get all of the excess dust from sanding off these layers. I'll make sure it's all off. I'll let it set for a long time so it's nice and dry. When I know it's dry, I'll come back with a sealer. This is the one I use, and I'll seal the skull just to keep, because a lot of people are going to want to touch it. I will seal the skull to keep my artwork the way I want it. And this sealer also prevents it from turning yellow or changing color over time. So it's really important to seal it when it's done. Now, I've learned this the hard way. Test your sealer, whatever sealer you're going to be using, underneath the skull on a part that you don't see, because occasionally the sealer will cause fracturing, and you do not want fracturing on your second to third layer of paint, and definitely you don't want fracture on your last seal coat. So test it first, spray it here. If it's good and it's glossy or it's the way you want it and there's no paint fracturing, then go ahead and apply the sealer to your whole skull. So that's it. That's the method. If you have any questions, just leave me a comment below, and I hope this was helpful for you, and have fun with this method.